The sun had barely begun to rise over the rolling plains when Margaret Harlow stepped onto the porch of her isolated farm. At 30, she had grown used to the lonely rhythm of her life, the creak of the windmill, the distant bleating of sheep, and the whisper of the dry grasses against the wooden fence posts. She liked it that way. The solitude suited her, a quiet buffer from the chaos of the town beyond the hills. But that morning, something unusual disturbed her routine. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement near the edge of the orchard. Squinting against the golden light, she saw a figure slumped near the old stone wall. At first, she thought it might be a lost traveler, but as she stepped closer, the sight stole her breath. A man, or rather a warrior, lay there, his body twisted in pain. His skin was dark, dusted with blood and dirt, and long jet-black hair fell across his face. He wore the remnants of traditional Apache clothing, now torn and muddied, and a quiver of arrows lay discarded beside him. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash ran across his shoulder. He was breathing shallowly, his chest rising and falling with great effort, and the faint tremor of fear or perhaps disbelief ran through him. Margaret's instincts kicked in. Despite the unease that pricked her mind, she could not leave him there. She hurried to the barn, dragging a thick blanket behind her, and returned to him. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to help you." He blinked once, and his dark eyes met hers. There was a wildness there, a wary suspicion, but also something more, an almost imperceptible plea for trust. She knelt beside him, assessing his injuries. The shoulder wound needed immediate attention. She tore strips from an old sheet, binding the deep cut as gently as she could. His leg, however, was another matter. "You can't walk," she murmured. "We'll have to get you inside." He tried to protest, but his words were hoarse whispers. Margaret leaned closer, catching fragments of what he said. Attacked. Soldiers, ambush. The story behind his wounds was already forming, shrouded in mystery. Whoever had done this had left him for dead. And yet he had somehow stumbled to her farm. Guided by sheer will or fate, with great effort, she lifted him onto a makeshift stretcher, a wooden door she propped on barrels, and carried him into the barn. The scent of hay and earth filled the air, mixing with the coppery tang of his blood. She laid him down gently and covered him with another blanket. Margaret knew she couldn't do much more, without risking further injury to him. She fetched water in a tin cup and pressed it to his lips. He drank slowly, his gaze following her every move, wary but not resisting. In the silence that followed, a bond began to form, fragile but undeniable by the time she had settled him on the loft hay. The sun was fully risen. Margaret sat on the edge of the loft, her fingers brushing the strands of his hair away from his face. She didn't know his name, and he didn't speak it. For now, names were irrelevant. Survival was what mattered. The farm was quiet again, but the ordinary peace had shifted. There was an electric tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that this encounter would change everything. Margaret had never encountered anyone like him, someone from the lands beyond the mountains, carrying the weight of a people she barely knew existed, yet someone whose pain and determination resonated deeply with her own sense of solitude and strength. As she watched him drift into a fitful sleep, she felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. Who was he? What had brought him here, wounded and vulnerable? And most unsettling of all, what did it mean for her quiet life that a stranger, fierce and mysterious, had suddenly become a part of it? The wind blew through the barn, carrying with it the scent of the plains and the whisper of secrets yet to be revealed. Margaret wrapped the blanket tighter around the injured Apache and sat close, determined to face whatever would come with him. Somewhere beyond the orchard, the faint echo of distant hooves reached her ears. But whether friend or foe, she could not tell. All she knew was that life on the farm would never be the same again. Margaret had never felt the weight of responsibility like this before. The injured warrior, who she still did not know the name of, lay on the loft hay in the barn, breathing shallowly and restless from pain. She had spent the morning tending to the worst of his wounds, washing the gash on his shoulder and wrapping it with the torn sheets. Each movement caused him to wince, but he didn't cry out, as if he were used to bearing pain. "Stay still," she whispered, pressing a hand against his shoulder. His dark eyes met hers, wary but trusting. That trust was fragile. It would take more than bandages and water to earn it. Margaret had no medicine, no proper tools. Just the supplies she kept for her own minor injuries. She fashioned a splint for his leg using a broomstick and strips of cloth, praying it would hold. The warrior grunted softly when she adjusted it, his face twisting with discomfort. "You?" "Survived," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She wondered what kind of person could endure what he had. "And now you're here, in my barn." He made a sound, a rough whisper she couldn't quite understand. She leaned closer, trying to catch his words, but they were fragments, lost in the dust and blood. Ambush. Soldiers, wrong place. Margaret's heart tightened. The attack must have been deliberate. Someone had hunted him, and yet he had found her farm as if fate had guided his steps. Her mind raced with questions. Who had attacked him? Why had he been alone? And why, out of all places, had he stumbled into her life? The sun climbed higher, and the barn grew warmer. She fetched water again, offering it in a tin cup. He drank slowly, his muscles tensing with each swallow, as though he feared the liquid would burn him. Margaret stayed beside him, observing him with an intensity she had never felt for another human being. He was more than a stranger. He was a puzzle, one that had walked into her life wounded and silent dot as the day passed. Margaret prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese, bringing it to the loft. The warrior didn't reach for it. His gaze followed her, wary and cautious, but the hunger in his eyes was unmistakable. She left the food near him, hoping he would eat when he felt able. The hours stretched on, filled with the quiet sounds of the farm, the distant clatter of hooves from passing travelers, the wind rattling the barn walls, and the soft rustle of the orchard leaves. Margaret's mind drifted back to her solitude, the life she had built alone. She had managed her farm, cared for her animals, and lived quietly. But this man, this injured, fierce stranger, had shattered that calm in an instant dot by late afternoon. He stirred again, his breathing heavy and labored. Margaret moved closer, adjusting the blanket over him. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the world outside the barn seemed to vanish. There was pain there, yes, but also defiance of fierce, unspoken spirit that refused to be broken. "You're going to be okay," Margaret said softly, though even she didn't fully believe it. She wanted to promise him safety, but she didn't know if she could. Outside, the wind whispered through the plains, carrying a faint, distant sound that made her uneasy. Hooves. Not her own, not her livestock. Someone or something was approaching. The warrior stirred again, his voice finally emerging, a low, rough whisper. Danger. Coming? Margaret's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just injured. Whatever had attacked him might still be near. She tightened her grip on the blanket around him, feeling a surge of protectiveness she hadn't expected. This stranger, who had appeared wounded and silent, had become her responsibility and perhaps her destiny. She sat with him through the fading light, listening to his shallow breathing, feeling the rhythm of his heart against the hay beneath her fingers. Outside, the shadows lengthened, painting the barn with streaks of orange and gold. The farm, her sanctuary, had become a place of unknown peril. Yet, even as fear crept in, Margaret felt a spark of determination. She would not let him fall not to injury, not to whoever pursued him, not to fate itself. She had found him for a reason. The question was whether she was ready to face the storm that had followed him to her doorstep. Night would come soon, and with it, secrets yet untold. Margaret tightened her hold on the warrior, knowing that tomorrow would test both of them in ways neither could imagine. The bond between them, fragile and new, had begun to form, and it would need to be strong if they were to survive what was coming. The first stars were beginning to appear over the prairie when Margaret finally allowed herself to step outside the barn and breathe. The air was crisp and tinged with the scent of earth and distant sagebrush. Yet, the stillness of the night did little to calm her racing mind. Whoever had attacked the warrior might still be close, lurking among the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Inside the barn, the warrior stirred again, groaning softly. Margaret leaned over him, adjusting the blanket around his broad shoulders. His breathing was less labored now, though still shallow, and the splint she had fashioned for his legs seemed to be holding. "I need to know who you are," she murmured, brushing a lock of black hair from his sweat-streaked face. His eyes flickered with reluctance, then softened, a silent acknowledgment that he would tell her. Eventually, hours passed before he spoke again, his voice hoarse but steady. "Tayan," he whispered. "My name?" "Tayan." "Tayan," Margaret repeated softly, tasting the word. It felt powerful, like the echo of ancient stories she had only ever read in dusty books. "All right, Tayan, you're safe here for now. But you need to rest. Can you do that?" He nodded slightly, but his gaze shifted to the barn door, tense and alert. Margaret followed his line of sight. Shadows moved beyond the fences, the faint crunch of footsteps on the dry earth carrying an unsettling rhythm. She couldn't see anyone clearly, but the sense of danger was unmistakable. Margaret reached for the lantern and placed it on the loft's edge, casting a soft, flickering light over Tayan's rugged form. The tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists caught the glow, glinting faintly like shards of sunlight trapped in beads and feathers. There was a majesty in him, even wounded. That made her heart pound. "I need to know what happened to you," she said quietly. Who attacked you?" Tayan's dark eyes shadowed with memory, and he swallowed hard. "Soldiers." "White men," he said finally. "Ambushed my people. I ran. His voice faltered, and he shook his head, frustration and grief mingling in a raw expression of vulnerability. "I survived because I had to." Margaret's chest tightened. The thought of the violence he had witnessed, the lives lost, and the relentless danger he had faced alone made her feel both fear and admiration. She wanted to ask more, to understand everything, but she also knew that pressing too soon could push him away. Instead, she focused on practicalities. "We need to make you stronger," she said. "I can't fix what's happened, but I can make sure you can move again." Using her limited supplies, she prepared poultices from herbs she kept for livestock, applying them carefully to the wounds that were slow to heal. Tayan flinched but did not resist, allowing her to tend to him. As she worked, she noticed subtle details, the taut muscles beneath his dusty skin, the calluses on his hands, the faint scars along his arms, each a silent testament to a life shaped by hardship and survival. Hours turned into night, and Margaret finally sat back, exhausted but determined. Tayan was asleep, his chest rising and falling more steadily. For the first time, she allowed herself to glance at him without fear, just awe at the raw strength and resilience of this man who had somehow walked into her life wounded and unbroken. The sound of wind brushing across the prairie reminded her that the world outside her farm had not gone quiet. She couldn't ignore it. Danger was still out there, and tomorrow would demand that she face it. Whether she was ready or not, as she watched over him, Margaret realized that something profound had begun to take root, a connection born of necessity, trust, and shared solitude. Tayan had come into her life by chance, but perhaps he was meant to stay. Perhaps together they could face the storm that had driven him to her doorstep. The barn grew silent, the lantern flickering gently in the night, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Margaret whispered softly, almost to herself, "We'll get through this, Tayan. Together." And for the first time since he had arrived, the warrior seemed at peace, even if only temporarily. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the plains in shades of gold and amber. Margaret had barely slept, keeping one eye on Tayan as he stirred on the loft hay. His breathing was steadier, his dark eyes alert now, scanning the barn with a cautious wariness that made her pulse quicken. "You need to stay inside," she whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from his face. "There's danger out there, and I can't protect you if you wander." Tayan gave a faint nod but remained silent. He was recovering, but his instincts were too sharp to be idle. Margaret watched him, marveling at the quiet strength radiating from his tense, muscular form. His tribal jewelry caught the early sunlight filtering through the barn slats, beads and feathers glinting like small, precious shards of history. She knew that the peace inside the barn would not last. The faint sound of hooves on the distant trail had haunted her sleep, and now it seemed closer. Margaret's heart tightened with unease. Whoever had attacked Tayan was not far behind, and they might strike at any moment. "Tayan," she said softly, "I need to know if you can move. Can you stand?" He slowly shifted, testing the weight on his injured leg. A grimace crossed his face, but he managed to rise, leaning heavily on the loft railing for support. Margaret's eyes widened not just at his pain, but at his determination. Even battered and injured, he was a warrior through and through. "I'll help you," she said, offering her hand. He accepted it, and together they navigated the narrow loft, the splintered wood creaking under their combined weight. Margaret felt a mixture of fear and awe-fear for what might be waiting outside. Awe at Tayan's resilience. Once he was on solid ground, the distant sound of hooves grew louder, more deliberate. Margaret's hand went instinctively to the small pistol she kept tucked in her belt. The old weapon felt heavy and unfamiliar in her grip, yet it gave her some sense of control. "Someone's coming," she warned. "We need to hide. Or fight." Tayan's dark eyes met hers, and she saw the flicker of understanding. He didn't speak, but his stance shifted, muscles coiling like a spring ready to release. He moved toward the barn door, peering through the cracks between the slats. Margaret followed, heart hammering in her chest. Two men on horseback emerged from the morning haze, their guns slung loosely but ready. Their faces were shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, and the glint of steel suggested they were soldiers or men who dressed like them. Margaret's breath caught. They were the ones who had attacked Tayan, no doubt tracking him relentlessly. "Stay back," Tayan murmured, his voice low and commanding. Margaret instinctively obeyed, crouching behind him as he shifted his weight, ready to defend them both. The men dismounted, moving cautiously toward the barn. Dust rose beneath their boots, and the wind carried the sharp tang of danger. Margaret gripped her pistol tighter, knuckles white, while Tayan silently positioned himself between her and the intruders. Despite his wounds, he radiated a presence that was impossible to ignore, muscular, fierce, and utterly commanding. One of the men stepped closer, and Tayan's eyes flashed. He didn't hesitate. With surprising speed, he moved to block the doorway, forcing the intruder to halt. Margaret could barely keep up with his movements, each one precise and controlled despite his injuries. His voice, low and unwavering, cut through the tense morning air. "Leave," Tayan said. The authority in his tone was absolute. "Or face the consequences." The men exchanged glances, unsure. They hadn't expected resistance from someone so injured, let alone someone with the commanding presence of a warrior. Margaret felt a surge of relief and pride. Even in his weakened state, Tayan was formidable, more than capable of protecting them both. After a tense moment, the intruders retreated, mounting their horses and disappearing back into the haze. Margaret exhaled slowly, her body trembling with adrenaline. She looked at Tayan, who stood tall despite the pain, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "You," she began, voice shaking. "You saved us." He met her gaze, expression unreadable but softer now. "We protect each other," he said simply. Margaret nodded, realizing that this was more than survival. Their bond had strengthened, forged in the fire of danger and trust. She didn't know what awaited them beyond the barn, but for now they had survived together, and that was enough. The day had barely begun when Margaret and Tayan worked quietly in the barn, reinforcing the doors and windows. The night's encounter with the men on horseback had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She refused to let fear dictate her life, and she could see that Tayan felt the same. Even wounded, his presence was a force of courage and determination that seemed to settle over the farm like a protective shield. "We need a plan," Margaret said, sweeping hay from the loft. "They'll come back. And if they do, we need to be ready." Tayan nodded silently, his dark eyes scanning the horizon through the gaps in the barn walls. Margaret noticed the way his muscles tensed with every distant sound, the wind in the trees, the rustle of prairie grass, the faint creak of the fence. His body was a map of strength, resilience, and survival, and she felt a mixture of awe and gratitude that he was on her side. Margaret gathered her courage. "I can make traps around the perimeter," she said, thinking of the simple mechanism she used to protect her livestock. "Nothing too deadly, just enough to warn us and slow them down." Tayan's eyes met hers, and for the first time he spoke more clearly, his voice low and commanding. "Good, I can help. But we need more than traps. They will come prepared. We need to be ready to fight if it comes to that." Together, they moved outside, Margaret's hands fumbling with rope and stakes while Tayan demonstrated how to set up warning snares and hidden tripwires. Despite his wounded leg and bruised shoulder, he worked with a precision and expertise that spoke of years of survival and combat. Margaret couldn't help but marvel at his skill. By midday, the farm had been transformed into a small fortress. Traps and barriers were carefully placed along the property line, and they had even moved a few barrels and crates near the barn to create makeshift cover in case of attack. Margaret wiped sweat from her brow, feeling a new sense of unity with Tayan. They were no longer just two individuals thrown together by chance, they were a team. Bound by necessity and mutual trust. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Tayan finally allowed himself a brief rest. He leaned against a wooden post, the splint on his leg visible but no longer hindering him as much. Margaret handed him a cup of water, and he drank slowly, dark eyes meeting hers. "They'll come," he said, voice low. "We cannot let them reach the barn. We must be ready, but why did you help me? Most would have left me to die." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The question was simple, but heavy with weight. She looked at him, seeing the vulnerability behind his fierce exterior. "Because I couldn't do otherwise," she said finally. "I saw you there, hurt and alone. I couldn't turn away. And because I think we both know that sometimes survival isn't just about living, it's about who stands with you." Tayan's gaze softened ever so slightly, and for the first time, Margaret sensed the beginnings of something more than trust, perhaps respect. Perhaps something deeper, something unspoken. But there was no time for sentiment. The wind carried the faintest sound of movement in the distance hoofbeats, perhaps, or the rustle of men moving through the grass. "Get ready," Tayan said, placing a hand briefly on Margaret's shoulder. Tonight, we face them again, together. Margaret swallowed hard, feeling both fear and determination surge through her. She had never imagined her quiet life on the farm could turn into this an old Western standoff with life and death at stake. But she now knew that she was capable of more than she had ever realized. And Tayan, he had become a pillar she could rely on, someone whose strength and courage inspired her in ways she had never experienced. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the prairie, Margaret and Tayan moved into position. The traps were set, the barn reinforced, and their hearts were steeled for the coming confrontation. Outside, the prairie held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, their pursuers drew closer, unaware that the farm they thought defenseless was anything but. Night had fallen over the prairie, and a heavy silence lay across the farm. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the grass and the occasional low call of a distant coyote. Margaret crouched behind a stack of crates near the barn, her hands gripping the small pistol she had carried since the first warning signs of danger. Her heart pounded with anticipation, every muscle taut with fear and readiness. Beside her, Tayan adjusted the bandages on his shoulder and tested the splint on his leg. Despite the pain etched across his muscular, shirtless frame, his eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the darkness. The tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists glinted faintly in the soft lantern light, a reminder of the strength and heritage that defined him. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice low but steady. Margaret could feel the authority in it, the unspoken command that calmed her racing heart. A rustle in the grass outside the fence confirmed his warning. Two men on horseback approached cautiously, their hats shadowing their faces, rifles ready. Margaret swallowed hard, squeezing the pistol tighter. Tayan's muscles coiled like springs, his bare torso tense and powerful under the dim light. "Remember," he said quietly, "we protect the barn. We protect each other. No mistakes." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of his confidence, the unspoken promise that he would fight for them both. She crouched lower, watching as the men dismounted and began moving toward the barn, unaware of the traps set around the perimeter. A thin wire snapped under one of their boots, sending him stumbling and giving Margaret a surge of hope. Tayan moved with incredible precision despite his injuries. He grabbed a heavy lantern from the barn, swinging it suddenly to startle the intruders. The flickering light caught the edges of his jewelry and the gleam of sweat on his dark skin, creating a figure that seemed almost mythic in its presence. "Who's there?" one of the men demanded, his voice rough. Betraying his uncertainty, Tayan stepped forward, muscular arms raised, his eyes fierce and unwavering. "Leave now," he commanded, "or you will face the consequences." The men hesitated, their confidence faltering as Tayan's silent power filled the air. Margaret fired a warning shot over their heads, the crack of the pistol echoing through the night. The combination of her defiance and Tayan's imposing presence was enough to make them reconsider. Slowly, cautiously, they began to retreat, their horses skittish in the darkness. As the intruders disappeared into the night, Margaret exhaled shakily, her knees trembling. Tayan lowered his arms, muscles relaxing slightly, but his eyes never left the dark horizon. "They will return," he said simply. "We must be ready." Margaret nodded, feeling a mix of fear, admiration, and something deeper stirring within her. She had seen Tayan in action, witnessed his strength and skill despite his injuries. But more than that, she had felt the protective bond he carried, the silent promise that he would not allow harm to come to her. Together they moved inside the barn, checking the barricades and ensuring that the traps were still in place. Tayan's presence was commanding, but there was a gentleness in the way he tended to her and the farm. A reminder that beneath the warrior's exterior was a man capable of compassion and loyalty. As they settled near the loft, Margaret offered him a cup of water, and he drank slowly, dark eyes meeting hers. "Why do you fight?" she asked softly, curiosity and respect mingling in her voice. Tayan looked at her, muscles taut but expression calm. "Because survival is not just about living," he said. "It is about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And it is about standing for what is right, even when the world turns against you." Margaret's heart swelled. In that moment, she realized that their fight was more than survival. It was a test of character, courage, and trust. And she had found an ally in Tayan, a man whose strength, wisdom, and fierce loyalty would change her life forever. The night stretched on, the wind whispering through the prairie, carrying with it a sense of both danger and hope. Margaret and Tayan sat side by side, silent but connected, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The farm, once a place of solitude, had become a battleground, but also a place where trust and courage had been forged in the fires of adversity. Dawn broke over the prairie, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The barn was quiet now, the aftermath of last night's confrontation settling like dust in the early light. Margaret stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and glanced over at Tayan. He was sitting on the fence, his muscular, shirtless form silhouetted against the rising sun. Long black hair fell over his dark eyes, tribal jewelry glinting faintly, catching the morning light. Despite the bruises and scratches from the previous day, he radiated strength and calm. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude and something deeper, something she hadn't expected, seeing him alive, resilient, and watching over the farm. "Tayan," she called softly. He turned his gaze toward her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a smile she had not seen before, a mix of relief, pride, and quiet affection. "The farm is safe," he said, his voice steady and strong. "For now." Margaret walked to him, feeling the soft prairie grass beneath her boots. "We couldn't have done it without each other," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I've ever known what it feels like to truly trust someone. Not until now." Tayan's dark eyes softened. "Trust is earned," he said. "And you earned it, Margaret. You did not turn away. You faced fear with courage. That is strength." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, realizing how deeply their bond had grown over the past days. It had begun with necessity, the need to survive, but it had become something else, a connection forged through danger, respect, and understanding. The farm, once a place of solitude, had transformed into a sanctuary not just for her, but for Tayan as well. The wounds he carried, both physical and emotional, had begun to heal in her presence, just as her own heart had opened to a world she had long shut out. "I want you to stay," Margaret said finally, the words trembling on her lips. "Not just because you saved my life, but because I can't imagine this farm without you." Tayan studied her for a long moment, the wind stirring the strands of his long hair. Then, slowly, he rose to his full height, the morning light catching the glint of his tribal jewelry. "I will stay," he said simply, "because this is more than survival. This is home, and you are part of it." Relief and joy surged through Margaret. She reached out, and for the first time, Tayan took her hand willingly, his grip strong and reassuring. Together, they walked along the fence line, surveying the farm. The distant plains stretched endlessly before them, wild and untamed, yet they no longer seemed threatening. The storm had passed, and in its place, a sense of peace and possibility had settled. Later that day, they worked side by side in the barn, repairing damage and tending to the livestock. There was laughter now, soft and rare, echoing through the wooden walls. Margaret felt lighter, as if the weight of fear and solitude had been lifted. Tayan moved with purpose and strength, guiding her with quiet patience, his presence steady and grounding Dot. By evening, they stood together at the edge of the orchard, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky blazed with orange and crimson, reflecting the fire and trials they had endured together. Margaret leaned against Tayan, feeling the warmth of his muscular frame, the calm steadiness that had carried them through danger and uncertainty. "You saved me," she murmured, almost to herself. "No," Tayan replied, his voice low and intimate. "We saved each other." For the first time since that fateful morning when he had appeared at her farm, Margaret felt truly whole. The Apache warrior, fierce, proud, and scarred, had become her companion, protector, and friend. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Their bond unbreakable. As the stars began to glitter in the night sky, Margaret and Tayan stood hand in hand, silhouettes against the vast open plains. The farm, the barn, the orchard, they were more than structures or land. They were symbols of survival, trust, and the unexpected ways in which lives can intersect and change forever. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Margaret knew that her life, once quiet and solitary, had been transformed by courage, loyalty, and the fierce heart of a man named Tayan. The prairie stretched endlessly, but now it felt like home, and together they were ready to face whatever came next.